Well, hello there, you guys. I'm so happy that you're here. I wanted to say before I get into today's episode that I am now taking submissions for the podcast. When I started my podcast, I knew I wanted this to be a place where members could share their experiences within the church because no two people have the same experience within the gospel and with the culture that surrounds it. And I find such value in hearing all types of stories. Not only does it help me to have more of an open mind and empathy, but it also helps others who might have similar experiences relate and feel less alone. So whatever your experience, I would love to hear it, and I'm now taking submissions for you to share. So often after I publish an episode, I get DMs from listeners sharing why the episode resonated with them and how they've had felt similar at times. And ultimately what I want is to have real member experiences to share along with the topics that we discuss in some of my episodes. So if you feel compelled to share your experience and your testimony within the gospel of Jesus Christ, head to my Instagram and you'll find a link in my bio for submissions. Okay, now that that's over, let me tell you what you can expect in today's episode. I sat down with my stake president, who is a family therapist, and we discussed how our church culture has impacted our perception of mental health and ways that we can use the gospel and professional help to navigate feelings of anxiety and depression. Welcome to Blonde Apologist. All right, well, welcome to a new episode of Blonde Apologist. Today, we are meeting with my stake president, President Mark Ogletree. And it was an inspired episode. I have had many listeners request an episode on mental health, mental illness. And a few weeks ago, I was watching Stake Conference, and I thought, I'm going to ask my stake president to come on and do this episode with me because I know it's a heavy topic. I know everyone has dealt with it in some capacity, whether in your own life or in the life of a loved one. Yeah. And I'm not an expert in it. I've experienced it myself, but I would love to have you introduce yourself and tell us why you are the expert and why the Spirit guided me to invite you to this episode.
You're going to put me right on the spot immediately.
Yeah.
So, Lauren, you want to know some things about me. So I graduated from BYU years ago. We lived in Arizona. That was where we kind of took our first job. So I did graduate school there, actually at Northern Arizona University, just because that's where we lived, and ended up doing a master's in counseling. Mm. And then we went to Utah State University, where I did a doctorate in marriage and family relationships. And then we went back to Texas and worked there for a while, for about 10 years, and then had a chance to come here to BYU. And took it because that was the dream the whole time, was to come to BYU and teach. And then I do have a practice here as well, a small little practice. And most of my practice is spent either dealing with marriage and family issues or depression and anxiety. And we do some addiction stuff too. So I've written a lot of stuff, not so much on anxiety and depression, although there is a book that we wrote about a year ago. A psychologist in Dallas named Ted Acey, who I did a lot of work with in Dallas. We wrote a book kind of from a gospel perspective on overcoming stress and anxiety and fear in our lives using gospel principles. So we do have that hanging out there. But I think there probably are others that are probably more expert, but I love the topic and I'm pretty passionate about it. We deal with it in our family too. I have some anxiety. And a couple of our kids do, and now a couple of our grandkids do. So it's something that we'll be, addressing throughout our lives and with them to help them as much as we can. Mm-hmm. I really do believe that sometimes the Lord gives us challenges so that we can learn and then find ways to help those around us. And we've been able to offer a lot of help to just immediate family members that have struggled with this as well.
Yeah. That's so good.
Yeah.
My listeners know that I love having discussions that are often maybe pushed under the rug in our church. And mental illness in the past has been that kind of conversation. It's kind of taboo.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it. We're definitely getting better as a church and as a society to acknowledge the realities of it. But I would love to hear from your perspective. Obviously, you're in church leadership. How have you seen the culture within our church impact the perception of mental illness?
I think there's certainly a level of perfectionism in our faith among many of the members. And so the idea is that if anything's wrong with us or if we need help from someone, it's a sign of weakness. So we've kind of had that stigma for a long time. In fact, I remember recently dealing with a family who the mother said to the son who was depressed on his mission and it looked like he might come home, she said, "Don't tell anyone that you're depressed. We don't want any of our family or anyone to know that," right? And I think that, to be honest, I think it's been an awesome pendulum swing coming more into the light, so to speak, of all these issues. Elder Holland has been great at talking about even his own depression. And I think, even with me to say to you, yeah, Lauren, I mean, when I had my greatest anxiety initially was when I was a bishop for the first time in our Texas ward. And it just hit me in such a hard way. But my point is, 20 years ago, I would have never even brought that up and shared that with you, right? I mean, who as the bishop, wants to tell his ward that, oh, I've got some anxiety
issues. It's like
issues.
You're showing your weakness.
Yeah. In fact, when we moved here and I still had some anxiety going on a little bit in my life, I remember talking to my doctor, just our family doctor, and I was the bishop of this ward at that point now that we live in, and I was having so much stress and just feelings of anxiousness. And for the first time in my life, after dealing with this for about 10 years, I asked my doctor, I said, what would happen if I just went on some medicine for a little while? Would that be helpful? He goes, yeah, you probably could benefit by that. And I go, I feel so dumb. I mean, here I am the bishop of the ward and I'm on medicine for anxiety. And my doctor just started laughing. He goes, do you know how many bishops and stake presidents I have on medicine right now for anxiety? And part of it is we are on overload. We take a lot of stuff on, and so, but anyway, I think that we're changing. I think our culture is changing in a good way where we're more free to talk about it. I felt very free to talk about it. I mention it. I'll mention it in my classes at BYU. I love to mention it to my clients that I see, because when they know that their therapist has been through anxiety, they're like, oh, wait a minute, this guy's been through this. I'm going to pay attention, So yeah, number one, we're fighting a culture of perfectionism.
Yep.
But and we're also fighting a culture of we are going to cross the plains and take care of ourselves and fight off anything that comes our way, to now a culture of, wow, we actually, as members of the church, probably bear a significant weight and load, because usually we have more children than most people do. We have church assignments that take us out of our home. A lot of people, even in a kind of normal, regular calling as a young men's assistant, whatever, you still are required to put some time in every week. We want to be active in our communities. We want to make a difference in the world. And so all that's going to spell, okay, you're going to put a lot of stress on yourself. So let's get ready for it and know how to handle it. So I'm actually really encouraged that we're talking more about these issues now.
I know. I remember whenever Elder Holland gave like a broken vessel, it really feels like that was the pivot where it's like, okay, we're going to talk about this and let's acknowledge the reality of it. So it is so good.
Let me share another perspective, if I can, just on mental illness. One of the things I've heard people say is, I don't want to admit that I'm anxious, or I don't want to admit that I'm depressed, because then I'm mentally ill. And I'm like, no, you're not.
It's not an identifier.
Right, but it's not an identifier, but also that's not mental illness. If you want to get really technical, depression and anxiety are what we call mood disorders in the field. It's a mood disorder. A mental illness is like schizophrenia. I mean, that's pretty heavy, right? That's going to have a huge impact on your life. But for me to look at someone and say, you're not mentally ill, you have a mood disorder, you're going to be okay, we can work on this. Just like if you had diabetes or high blood pressure or whatever, you would work on it and you get medical help for that. But I think we've pushed anxiety and depression into such a place that now people are like, do I need to go to a mental hospital? And I'm like, no. You know how many people, live their lives with this, with these kind of challenges, and they function I feel like I function at about the highest level a person could function at, working from 6 a.m. till midnight some days. George Albert Smith was another one. There's a great book by Mary Jane Woodger. I don't know if you've heard it before. It's called it's either Against All Odds or Against the Odds, but it's the story of George Albert Smith's fight against depression and anxiety. And here he was, the president of the church, and struggling with anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
And in those days, no one knew what it was. I mean, they were actually like, you need to go to St. George and sleep outside for a week. You need to go to the beach in California. And I mean, they really didn't know what was going on with him, but we can look back now and go, oh my gosh, that was every single symptom of anxiety and depression. And the president of the church had it,
Yeah.
you know.
So. Okay, I'm so glad you said that because that's new to me.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to identify it as mental illness. What did you call it?
A mood disorder.
A mood disorder.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and under the umbrella of anxiety and depression, there's a lot of different things that fall under those, from OCD to, but they're not mental illnesses. You know, the mental illness stuff is the stuff that, now this is my opinion, right? But these are the things that sometimes you have to be hospitalized for, and you're on significant medications, and your life is impaired in such a way that you're probably not able to function that well. I mean, when you're anxious, but yet you're working 55 hours a week, and you're okay. I mean, you're going to be okay. You can do this, right? You're doing hard things already.
So I want to talk about both.
Yeah.
And I need your advice on both, right?
Yeah.
I think everyone can relate to the feelings of anxiety or the feelings of depression, but also to the members who have it to the point where it is affecting their day to day and preventing them from feeling the Spirit. I think both. We need to talk about both.
And by the way, let me clarify and say, yes, there are levels of depression and anxiety that, I mean, people don't want to leave their homes, right? They don't want to come out from under the covers.
It can be debilitating.
And it can be debilitating because it is it's a significant dose of anxiety or depression. So I don't want to minimize that. I'm just saying, for the garden variety average person that's coming out and saying, man, I'm really stressed or anxious today, that those people can usually function at a pretty high level. But yeah, we've seen people that can't, right? I mean, they just can't.
Yeah. I would love to hear your thoughts on our scriptures that we're commanded to fear not. We're commanded to be of good cheer. Can you help us reconcile the teachings of faith and hope and the realities that sometimes we can't feel those things?
Yeah. No, I think that's great. So, yeah, as we think of things like, you said, be of good cheer, fear not, those kind of things, I think those are great. Elder Holland said those are commandments. I mean, he kind of viewed it as, it's a commandment to exercise faith and to be of good cheer. Or neither let your hearts be troubled nor let them be afraid. And he says that is a commandment that's almost broken by almost all of us constantly. And so I don't really see a conflict. I think, researchers have shown us, and I say researchers meaning like scriptorians have shown us, that the commandment to fear not is actually one of the most common phrases in all of the scriptures. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
So certainly the Lord is telling us, and I think he's preparing us. He's helping us to understand that we do need to exercise faith in him, trust in him, and believe in him, and know that one of the great cures for anxiousness is to me, it's an ailment of a lack of faith. And it's not a lack of faith in the sense of, I just don't believe in the gospel, or I don't have a testimony. It's a lack of faith in, I don't see how this is going to work for me. I mean, it'll probably work for everyone else, right? But it's probably not going to work for me. And so, frankly, Lauren, those verses of Scripture have actually given me great strength and hope and an anchor, that I could hold on to. And it doesn't mean that, no, I'm afraid. I mean, I am afraid today, let's say, right? I'm really anxious and I'm fearful, but I'm going to rely on those scriptures, to help me, to inspire me, and to give me strength that I don't have right now, But I think that if I understand your question, that we actually live in a world where that's super hard to do, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of hearing you say. And so all the more reason, I just recorded a podcast episode on Joseph Smith and his optimistic attitude. And that's what I would want a lot of people to know, is that, despite all these challenges that we see in the world and the craziness and the chaos, we can still be happy, we can have joy, and we can be full of faith. It's a gift. It's something that we should pray for. But those expressions that the Savior has shared with us on on to be faithful or to have faith have given me great hope and strength.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm answering your question the right way, but
No, I think I see it too as encouragement of we're always asked to be better and ways to improve, and to me it's like, yeah, there are scary things. There are things that I fear for my life, for my children, the economy, our country, our faith, yet those phrases in the scripture are my encouragement too. No,
yeah.
if God is telling us that we don't need to fear, then what does that tell me about his vision of the plan for me?
Yeah.
Right. So it is encouraging.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of President Nelson's talk about joy in every circumstance, whatever, when he talks about despite all these terrible things going on in the world globally, but also in our individual lives, the fact that men are that they might have joy. He says, President Nelson said, that's actually the joy that Christ offers. He's offering this joy and this happiness despite all the stuff that's going on, which is kind of an incredible thought that, wait, you mean we can still be happy with all this craziness? Mm-hmm. And the answer is yes. I mean, and it's not easy. I mean, it's something we have to work at, but we can find, I think gratitude is part of the secret. There's a lot of gospel principles that tie into anxiety and depression, and gratitude is one of them. If we can have this focus on being grateful and noticing the little miracles in our lives and the Lord's hand in our lives every day, it's so helpful to be healthy mentally and emotionally and spiritually.
Mm-hmm. I experienced situational depression shortly after coming home from my mission.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling so out of control of my emotions, but also like sometimes just completely numb, like just incapable of feeling the spirit in those moments. I would love to hear any advice that you have for people who might mentally be in a place where they can't feel the spirit.
Yeah, that's a great question. And just for anyone who's listening, just so anyone, just to make it clear, when you are in a deep state of depression or anxiety, that is exactly how you feel, right? It feels kind of dark, and it feels like the heavens are hollow, and it feels like you're not getting answers, and you just feel like I'm not even in a position.
Connection.
Yeah, I've lost this connection with God.
And I've heard a lot of people say they feel unworthy. They're like, what am I doing wrong?
Yeah. And so what I would say, my take on that is that's exactly what the ailment is. The ailment actually, it feels like it's disconnected you from God in some way, but just because of how you physically feel, and how you probably emotionally feel. So I would want people to know, hey, you know what? That's actually normal. Don't panic, because that's kind of how you're supposed to be feeling if you have that. So the trick is, and the key is to not give up. And I don't want this to sound trite, like, oh, just do this, but keep trying and be persistent is actually the answer, because there's going to be a breakthrough. At some point, the clouds are going to open, the wall's going to break open, whatever metaphor you want to use. And at some point, it's going to happen. And I know that was exactly how it was like for me, where I just felt like, oh boy, I feel so disconnected. I feel so hollow right now. And I still remember the day that I was running, I was jogging and listening to a conference talk by President Uchtdorf. And all of a sudden, this was like 5 or 6 months later, I just felt this outpouring of the Spirit. And I know we're all different. That could happen for some maybe after a year or two or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I would tell people not to give up, because there's still great benefit. Even if we're not feeling a powerful, let's say, manifestation of the Spirit in our lives, we can still be guided by the words of living prophets and the scriptures. Right. Maybe we're not feeling what we used to feel, but once again, okay, that's part of the illness. It's okay. Just be persistent, because you're going to break through. And then once you break through, it's pretty awesome how it feels like that the clouds are open, and now the connection is back, So I would just tell people, don't give up.
Mm-hmm. And also, how do we balance our pursuit in the gospel with getting professional help?
One of the cool things about the gospel is that the gospel is a great medicine in so many ways. There's so many things that we teach in the church that actually are great for our mental health, And for example, scripture study. And I say that because I've read a lot of books by people who aren't members of our church that are saying, oh, you should read something inspirational every day. Okay, well, we could read the scriptures and prayer. We teach a lot in the church about exercise and taking care of ourselves and eating right. And so there's a lot of, we talk about, you can read the Doctrine and Covenants, going to bed early and waking up early. And there's just a lot of great health practices that are a part of our theology in so many ways. Writing in a journal. I mean, almost any therapist would tell you that's a great remedy for any kind of mental health issue. And we've been talking about that for years, And so, number one, there are things that we can do, within the gospel framework to get our life balanced, to get us in a good spot, to have healthy practices in our lives. And I would tell people, okay, so you're trying to do those things. And by the way, relaxation techniques would be part of that, any kind of stress relief. And if it's not working, and you've been at it for a little while and you're not really feeling better, then I would say, okay, the next step is to go get a really great, awesome counselor, this can help you. And now they're going to help prescribe some therapeutic interventions that are going to even take this to a higher level. You may even need to be on some medicine for a while. And that's another misconception that so many people have, that if they go on a medicine, that this is for the rest of their life, and they don't understand that. Go on medicine for a few months and see if it helps. And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, go off it. It's not a big deal. You can do that. So I would say the gospel is a big part of the intervention, but another part of the intervention is getting the mental health help that you need, because there are a lot of great tools and skills. Like I had to learn a lot of skills with anxiety that I wasn't familiar with. Yeah. I'm like, oh, I need to be doing this every day. And then, okay, I can do, this is how you counter negative thoughts. Oh, okay. I didn't know. There's a lot of tools, that a therapist can provide that can be really helpful. So I'd say the gospel and therapy go very well together.
Yeah, I feel like as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we are well equipped to tackle these issues.
Yeah.
If anything, we should be able to, we can do it. We're very blessed.
So, Lauren, can I say something else while we're kind of right in this area for a minute?
Please.
Another thing that it's good for us to be aware of is that there's so much data out there that's published and advertised and marketed that's always not, it's not necessarily true, right? Mm. For example, the divorce rate. We've heard our whole lives the divorce rate is 50%. The researchers who published that have come out recently and said, we really never meant that. That was just a projection, Well, the divorce rate really is like 30%, and then if you're religious, it goes down about 10 more points. And if you're college educated, it goes even further down. But no one's telling people that. So still today, people go into marriage believing, I've got a 50-50 shot at this.
Yeah.
And it's not even true. And the same is true with mental health and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Or in other words, well, I should say just maybe religion in general, but there's a real negative, slant out there, or bias, that religion causes people to be mentally unhealthy. Yet the reality is the research says exactly the opposite.
Right.
That religion actually helps people to have better mental health. There's so many great benefits. People who are religious have the strongest marriages in our country. People who are religious have children that are the most well-adjusted, well-balanced, academically performing, athletically performing. I mean, religion is actually really good for us. Now, sometimes we mess it up and we take it too far, and sometimes we can become very perfectionistic, and
right.
and we can actually cause our own religion to run us into the ground. And so, and we know that there are people who do that, but for the most part, if we're just living our faith the way that we should and getting great strength from the Savior and from the gospel, and we have the Spirit in our lives, that's going to help us so much with mental health issues.
Through the research that you've done, what are you seeing are the biggest threats to us and our children for their mental health, and how can we guard ourselves and them against it?
Lauren, I think that's a great question. And there's never one answer, right? That's another thing I always believe, that it's always an intersection of multiple things, that are causing some of the challenges. So I would say anxiety and depression are at higher levels than they've ever been. Usually the rate is around 30%, somewhere in there, of people that, and that's true with teenagers as well. Elder Christofferson actually gave a great talk about a year ago. No, maybe less than that. It was in 2024, so it was this year, like in January. And they, I don't know if everyone knows this, but the church does research. They just don't let, they just don't let it out. But they do research, and every now and then they will share some of it. And Elder Christofferson shared some of it, and what he was sharing was LDS, teenagers, the rates of anxiety for LDS teens. And it was about at what I just shared, about in that 20-30% range, pretty much in all the different parts of the world. In Africa, it was like 48 or 49% of, and I think that those kids who live over there live in a really unstable, kind of scary place, right? And so anyway, so back to your question. Sorry, I always get on these little rants, but what are the things I see? I see several things intersecting at the same time, and I'll just share a couple with you. Number one, there's heredity, and we don't ever give that enough credit. But if you have anxious people or depressed people in your family, and grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, whoever, there's a really good chance you could have some of those genetics in you, and you would be more prone, to be diagnosed with some type of mental illness if you have people that have had it. It's super hereditary, and so just knowing that you have those genetics could be helpful, because you could say, oh, great, if I have that, I need to really be careful with this, and this, however you choose to live your life. Another kind of intersecting event in my mind would be, and people don't want to hear this, but I'm just going to say it because it's true, but we've been coddled a little bit, right? That the generation now isn't as equipped to deal with super hard things as previous generations. In other words, every generation is a little bit lighter, including mine. I mean, if you compared my generation to the ones before me who went to war and everything else, right, we didn't have to do that, but we just had to work at the grocery store when we were 16 or whatever. But the coping skills have been passed down from parents to children, have been diluted a little bit over time, where now it's hard to say it this way, but just there are so many out there who don't have the ability to cope and deal with difficult things. So now you throw a pandemic on top of that, where for the first time people felt this uncertainty and like, we don't know what this means, and I could actually die maybe, or whatever people were afraid of. And so there were astronomical upticks in depression and anxiety during COVID, like up to like an 80% increase. 80 to 90%. I mean, it's leveled back down a little bit now, but still, that was just, we weren't prepared for that, And now throw in social media, as another factor. And there's multiple reasons why social media is causing people to be anxious and depressed. Number one, the content of what they're reading, seeing, being exposed to. But number two, the amount of time that they spend on that away from other things that could be more worthwhile and beneficial. For example, think of a kid 20 or 30 years ago who may have spent this afternoon, on a Thursday afternoon, practicing the piano for an hour, where now they'll spend 2 hours just scrolling through social media. I mean, the benefit is just night and day of, or a kid who has to work or has chores or things like that. And so Jonathan Haidt, so he's the author of The Anxious Generation, right? And he's the one that does a great job of documenting how in 2007, when iPhones now come out for the first time and people have access to that, and then the anxiety and depression rates correlate, or at least are associated with this huge, once again, upswing in rates of depression and anxiety, and also rates of unhappiness, and stress, And so he's really bold in this book. I don't know if you've seen some of the things he said in there, but he's talking about, he's like, if I'm a parent again, my teenagers are not having a cell phone, and they're not going to have access to social media until they're at least 16, because then they'll be able to, their brain will be, at least developed enough to deal with those kind of things. So once again, genetics, the environment that we live in, social media, the lack of coping skills, it all kind of comes together, and it puts us at risk now in ways we haven't ever been at risk before.
Yeah. And it almost sounds heavy, but like we were just saying, like we are equipped with the tools.
Yeah.
that we need to navigate these things.
Well, I was going to say there was an article in a very prestigious journal called The Atlantic, and the article was there was a question. It said, "Have iPhones ruined a generation?" And I think it was a 20-page article, but I think it could have just been one word: yes. Yeah, that's easy. So here's the cool part that I'm seeing right now: my own children who are your age are saying, "Oh yeah, our kids aren't going to have access to social media or iPhones until later in their lives. We're not going to give an 11-year-old kid a loaded gun, basically,
Of course.
And so I do think that parents are going to be wise. I think people are going to learn from what's happened in the last 10 years and say, "Hey, let's dial this down. Let's get back to some fundamentals here."
Yeah.
And maybe really restrict or at least regulate the use of our children's phones and social media access.
And teach media literacy.
Yeah.
Help them know how to navigate and to not compare and take reality versus have these curated
Sometimes if a
videos.
kid will just talk to a parent and say, "Hey, we're at the dinner table, right? Here's what I saw today. Here's what I heard. Here's what I read. Mom and Dad, what do you think?" And they have a parent go, "That's actually crazy," or, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's probably how it is," or whatever. But just that alone can be helpful. It was amazing how the COVID pandemic shaped the values of so many of our teenagers during that time that were, now having their genders being redefined and some of the other challenging things of the mental health, everything, just because of how much time they were on their computers doing homework, when in reality they were actually on these other sites that were kind of pulling them away from their own values. So anyway, so parents need to be involved. I think that's another, if we're talking about teenagers, but even for parents, if we will just take care of ourselves, balance our lives, engage in great health practices, and limit our time as parents on social media.
Set the example.
Yeah. Elder Kieran gave a talk at BYU a few years ago, and he shared the experience of being on social media for a while, reading news things, everything else. By the end of the day, feeling just really, really kind of dark, you know what I mean? And just kind of hollow, and then picking up a church book that one of our apostles wrote and reading it and just saying, within 10 minutes, I felt the light again and the Spirit back with me. And so we just have to monitor ourselves with some of these things and be smart about what we're exposing ourselves to.
Yeah, I think it was in 2020, when President Nelson invited us to take 2-week fast from social media.
Yeah.
And I remember the impact that had on my life. And now I do that fast. I try to do that on Sundays, right?
Yeah.
And just take a break from social media. And I think we occasionally just need to completely step back to remember our reality and help our brains reset, because we are so accustomed to having this computer in our hands and our eyes.
Yeah.
Looking at it.
All day long.
The effects it has. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a good practice.
Yeah.
To step back and to take breaks.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have much to say on this, but one of my biggest fears as a parent, and something that I see rampant in Utah too, is suicides rate among teenagers and preteens. What's happening, and how can we as parents have open conversations with our kids to help them navigate the tragedies that they're dealing with?
Yeah. It's really interesting. I have some colleagues that I work with at BYU that this is like their area of research. They just spend so much time in this area. Number one, what I would say is some of the suicide data, like I was saying a minute ago, is kind of skewed. It doesn't always accurately portray what's going on. For example, and I probably shouldn't be quoting them exactly when I don't have it right in front of me, but one of the things that they've talked about in their research is the suicide belt. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, but we live in the suicide belt.
Yeah. And
the suicide belt is basically the Intermountain West, the Rocky Mountain area. And one of the things that people have documented in their research is that, this is going to sound crazy, but I'm just going to say it because it's printed in professional journals, but when the elevation is high, and we live in a high elevation, the suicide rate is higher for some reason, and we don't really know all the reasons for that. Another myth that could be debunked is that most of the suicides that occur in our state, but also in this suicide belt, are actually in in rural areas, not in urban areas, but in rural areas where there's more access maybe to guns or whatever. But that may be a very different look than what people are thinking when they think in terms of suicide. Now, that doesn't mean that people in the teenagers and others in our urban areas aren't taking their lives, because we know that they are.
Yeah,
right?
and even one life is too many.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It doesn't matter that the numbers are high or low.
Yeah.
There's one too many.
Right. Here's a couple things about suicide that I would say. Number one, parents want to have a great open dialogue with their kids where they're talking about things like that on occasion and visiting that. Number two, parents need to be able to cue into the signs. I mean, when you see that your child is withdrawn and they're not talking and they're not going to school and their grades have dropped, and there's 5 or 6 other indicators like that, we have to pay attention to the indicators. There's a lot of times we hear of suicides where parents will say, "Oh my gosh, I saw this, this, and this, but I just didn't worry about it too much. I just thought they would pull out of that." Yeah. It could be a phase or something like that. So we want to pay close attention to that. And we want to try to answer their questions and be there for them. And parents can be great listeners and great therapists and just to ask our children questions and listen. Those are the type of things that I would want to pay close attention to. But you're looking for just any kind of behavior in our children that just doesn't seem right. They're not themselves, right? We just want to pay close. And we don't want to let them isolate. Sometimes when they're isolated, I've actually had parents I've talked to that are bringing food to their teenage kid on the second floor of their house and sliding it under the door. And I'm like, wait, you're okay with that? So your kid's eating in their room and they're not coming down with the family for dinner, and you're just like we're at a zoo or something where they're just sliding the food under. And anyway, and so, yeah, we got to be careful, and we got to try to get our kids the help that they need to, and get them to somewhere where they can be helped. It's really hard with teenagers, I'm not going to lie. It's really hard if a teenager doesn't want to get professional help. Yeah. It's hard to make them want to do that, and so that's why it's really even more important for parents to just stay close to them and just watch closely what those signs look like.
Thank you for that. I'd love to end with your expertise. Let's focus a little bit about marriage, families, life. That's where mental health issues might often arise, is the stability and the satisfaction in our marriages and our family life. What advice would you give? How do we uphold strong families? And I don't know, what are you seeing? What do you like to share?
One of the things I would say is that we have to identify our values and really articulate what those are, and then develop them and teach them in our homes, because the world now, the values that the world is teaching are so contrary, to the gospel in so many ways. And so we want to really help our children develop those, develop values, develop great character traits. Families, from a LDS perspective, we want families to practice the religion in the home and teach their children faith and teach them to follow prophets, and to teach them how they can be happy and how the gospel brings happiness. But the other part that we forget about sometimes, and it's super easy, is families should be having fun together. Families, you want to make it so that there's so much fun going on in your family that they don't want to go anywhere, And there's a great famous story about my wife when she was a teenager, but talk about FOMO. She may have been the first FOMO person, but she would find ways to have the date bring her home early, because all she could think about is how much fun her family was having. And she's on this date with this guy she doesn't even like that much. And she's like, how do I get out of here and get home? Because they're all having fun at home. And I thought, well, there's a great home right there when a teenager wants to be at home, because it's going to be fun. And so, yeah, we've got to find ways to speak their language and connect with them and spend time together and do fun things together. And while we're doing all that, we're teaching and influencing and building great relationships. That's the other part of it, is we just have to build great relationships with our family members, so that we all want to be together all the time. We have 5 or 6 children that live here in this area, and they come here a lot. It's not unusual to have them here as mothers with their husbands and with kids. And we love it because in our mind, that's a way they're making a statement. And the statement is, we still like hanging out with mom and dad. We still like coming over and hanging out with them. And we like hanging out with them. And so it makes it fun. So yeah, build relationships, have fun, build your foundation on the rock. And I think that, Lauren, that we can still have great, happy lives in this world that we live in. And we could teach our kids how to be happy and how to laugh.
Yeah. And if that is their experience in the home, then it also is a good association with the gospel. I feel like that's one reason why I was so drawn to the gospel and wanted to hold on to it, is because my home was evidence of the fruit of the gospel.
Yeah.
And the joys. Not to say that if you came from a broken home, you don't see the value of the gospel. But for me, that was a key thing. And so I feel that for my children too, is I want it to be associated with goodness, fun, and love. And we can do that as parents.
Yeah. Amen.
Well, is there any other advice or thoughts that maybe as you were preparing that you would want to share with the audience today?
I just think, Lauren, what I would say is that to be good at all these things we're talking about, to have a great marriage, to have a great family, to have great kids, we need to pay attention to those people around us that have all that, or at least they seem to, and try to learn from mentors and role models in our lives. But we also have to read. I think that's one of the lost arts, today, is that we don't have as many people reading. We'll go to the internet, to get some answers, and that's probably fine too. There's probably some great places to do that. But the way that I see it is, to have a successful marriage and family today, you have to have tools. In the old days, you could fake it. Everyone was married. Everyone had kids in the neighborhood. And so what's the big deal? We're all doing this together. But today, it's not as family friendly, and so if we're going to be successful at it, we have to have the tools that are necessary. And I would say, and it has to be your top priority. If it's not your top priority, then you risk losing your marriage and family.
Yeah. So what are some of the books that you would recommend
to gain
some of those tools?
Yeah, the Anxious Generation is a great one for right now.
Okay.
And that's a great one. There's, when it comes to marriage, one of my favorite books is called Beyond the Myth of Marital Happiness by Blaine Fowers. That book is about 20 years old now, but it's incredible. There are books on the way that social media has permeated. Glow Kids is one of the way that social media is kind of taking over and saturating our children. So that's a great one. There's some great books. Focus on the Family is a great organization. That's a Christian organization out of Colorado Springs, but they have 2 podcasts. They have one on marriage and one on parenting, but every podcast they're talking about some of these books that are being written by great Christian authors. And so if people went to my website, which is just www.markogletree.com, there's an entire list of books that we recommend to people at our counseling practice for marriage and parenting kind of issues as well.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that, and thanks for being willing to come on. I'm really grateful for you. And as I said earlier, I feel like we are blessed in the church. We have the tools and we have the truth to help us through these days.
These challenging times. Yeah. Lauren, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
If you are interested in any of the books or the podcasts that he recommended, I will be linking them in my stories today, and I'll make sure to save them so that future listeners can find them as well. I also wanted to put in a little plug-in for BetterHelp. This is not sponsored at all. I wish it was, but BetterHelp is a tool that I have used in my moments of need where you can get paired with a therapist super quickly. I know locally it can be hard to find a therapist and find someone that you connect with, but if you try BetterHelp, it is online, everything is virtual, and you can get connected with a therapist within 24 hours. So really quick, find someone that you can talk to. And if it's not a good fit, then you just ask for someone else. You don't have to tell that person to their face you don't want to use them again, but you can use the app to try a different therapist, and it's just a great resource that my husband and I have used in the past. So if you're interested in finding a therapist fast, try out betterhelp.com. But as always, I love you guys. Thanks so much for listening, and let's chat next week.